7 men crossed onto the Filchner ice shelf in the austral summer of 1911, carrying instruments designed to measure the known world. They did not return with the measurements they intended. They returned with something else entirely, and for most of them, the remainder of their lives was spent trying to find words adequate to describe what they witnessed beneath that frozen sky. My name is Edmund Harcastle. I was 26 years old when I joined the Imperial Antarctic Surveying Auxiliary as a junior cartographer. I'm 81 now, and I've never spoken publicly about what happened during those 11 days on the southern ice. My colleagues who survived also chose silence. 2 of them are dead. The third, Geoffrey Marsh, lives in a care home in Edinburgh and has not spoken a coherent sentence in 3 years, though the nurses say he sometimes draws the same shape over and over on the margins of newspapers. A long, curved line, a slow arc, like the edge of something enormous seen from very far away. I have decided to speak now because I'm old enough that no one will think me mad, and because silence carries a weight that eventually becomes unbearable. I carried mine for 55 years. That is long enough. I want to be precise about the circumstances, because precision matters when describing something most people will immediately dismiss. I was not an excitable young man. I had studied geography and surveying at King's College in London and had worked 2 previous seasons in Greenland as part of a Danish geological survey. I was accustomed to cold environments, to the way isolation affects the senses, and to the tricks that extreme conditions play on human perception. I knew those tricks. I accounted for them. What I am about to describe cannot be explained by any of them. The expedition was organized under the authority of the Royal Geographical Society, with secondary funding from the Admiralty. Our task was to extend the known cartographic survey of the eastern edge of the Filchner Shelf, a region only partially documented during earlier expeditions. We were to triangulate fixed reference points, record ice depth measurements, take barometric and temperature readings, and produce a working map of approximately 40 miles of uncharted shelf territory. Technical work, methodical work, the kind that requires patience and offers very little drama, which was precisely the kind I preferred. There were 7 of us. Captain Aldous Fenwick, 53, our expedition leader, a naval officer who had served 2 previous Antarctic tours and who ran operations with cheerful efficiency. Senior surveyor Thomas Bridwell, 40, one of the finest practical cartographers in Britain. Geologist Dr. Philip Royce, 44, methodical and deeply cautious, whose instinct was always to find the natural explanation before entertaining any other. Geoffrey Marsh, my fellow junior surveyor, 24, endlessly enthusiastic. Our dog handler and provisioner, a Norwegian named Christopher Dahl, 38, who had made 4 polar crossings and whose opinion on ice conditions I trusted above any instrument. Finally, 2 general assistants, brothers Robert and James Calder, 29 and 27, former merchant sailors of practical toughness, I found enormously reassuring. That we had been deposited by ship at a coastal access point and had been traveling by dog sled for 4 days before reaching our survey zone. Conditions during those 4 days were, by Antarctic standards, exceptionally good. The surface was firm, the winds modest, the sky a pale, clear blue stretching without boundary in every direction. I remember the silence, the first thing that always struck me about Antarctica, a silence so complete it felt less like an absence of sound and more like a presence. The dogs moved well. Morale was high. We established base camp on the afternoon of the 5th day on a stable flat section of shelf approximately 3 miles from the eastern survey boundary. The ice here was, by Dahl's estimate, between 40 and 50 feet thick. We erected our 2 main tents, secured the equipment sledges, and built a low wind barrier from compacted snow, and by evening had a functioning camp. We ate well that first night, tinned beef and biscuits and a small measure of rum dispensed by Fenwick with pharmacist-like precision, and discussed the survey schedule. Everything was orderly. Everything was as it should be. The first tremor came in the early hours of that first night at camp. I was not asleep. I'd been lying on my sleeping roll reviewing survey notes by lantern when the surface beneath me moved. It was not violent. It was more like the sensation of lying on a large wooden floor when someone heavy walks across the room at a distance. A slow, deep pulse transmitted through the ice directly into my body. I felt it in my back, in my hips, and I sat up immediately because the sensation was wrong in a way I could not immediately name. Yet ice fractures produce a sharp cracking movement, a sudden release of tension. What I felt was nothing like that. It was slow, it was rhythmic, and then it was gone. I listened for a long time afterward. Nothing. The dogs had not reacted. I told myself it had been a distant fracture, perhaps many miles away. The vibration carried through dense ice across a considerable distance. I wrote a brief note in my journal and eventually fell asleep. At breakfast, I mentioned it to Bridwell. He nodded and said he had felt something similar an hour before I had, a single deep pulse, and had attributed it to distant fracturing. Dahl, pouring coffee without looking up, said he had felt 2 separate pulses during the night, at midnight and at 3 in the morning. He said the dogs had moved slightly but had not barked, and he said he was not certain what had caused it, but that he did not think it was standard fracturing activity. Dahl's uncertainty meant something. He was a man who only spoke when he had something precise to say. He did not say he was concerned. He said he was not certain. For Dahl, that distinction was significant. Fenwick asked Royce whether the vibrations were consistent with known geological activity in shelf ice. Royce said that tremors transmitted through ice shelves were well documented, generally associated with calving events, internal fracturing, or tidal stress. The rhythmic quality I described was somewhat unusual, as fracture tremors were typically irregular, but there was no reason to consider it anything other than natural. Fenwick nodded. We packed our instruments and began the day's work. And when the conversation was not raised again until the second night, produced something that could not be as easily explained. The survey work that day went well. We established 3 triangulation stations, took careful measurements, and began a working map framework that Bridwell and I would refine over the following days. The Antarctic light was the particular flat quality that eliminates shadows and gives the landscape a 2-dimensional character, as though you are standing inside a drawing rather than a real place. I've always found it unsettling. It is as though everything is surface and nothing has substance beneath it. That night, Geoffrey Marsh woke me at approximately 4 in the morning by gripping my shoulder and saying my name twice in a very carefully controlled voice. He was kneeling beside my sleeping roll with his lantern. His face in the light was unusual. Not pale, precisely. Very still in the way a person becomes still when managing a strong internal reaction through conscious effort. I asked what was wrong. He told me to come outside and to be quiet about it. The temperature outside was approximately minus 22 degrees Celsius. The sky was extraordinary, a vast sweep of stars so dense and brilliant that the darkness between them seemed almost incidental. The ice surface lay pale and luminous, reflecting starlight with a faint blue quality. There was no wind. The silence was absolute. Marsh pointed toward the open ice surface to the north, perhaps 150 yards distant. He told me to watch. For perhaps 15 seconds I saw nothing unusual, and then I saw it. A section of the ice surface, perhaps 40 feet across, slowly rose, and not dramatically, not violently. It rose perhaps 3 or 4 inches at its apex, a gentle convex bulge pushing upward through the flat plain, and then, with the same unhurried slowness, it subsided. A pause of perhaps 30 seconds. The bulge appeared again, shifted slightly to the east, 50 feet along the surface. It rose, It subsided. It moved. I watched this happen 4 more times before I said anything. The bulges were consistent, appearing at intervals of approximately 30 to 40 seconds, each one 40 to 60 feet from the previous, tracking a gradual curve moving southward and slightly west, passing in a wide arc around the northern edge of the cave. The ice simply deformed upward and then returned to its natural position as whatever was beneath it continued to move. Something large was passing below the ice, and I went inside and woke the others. Bridwell came out immediately and watched with the focused intensity of a man cataloging what he sees. Royce observed for 2 minutes and began talking about submarine pressure dynamics in a voice just slightly too measured, the voice of a man deploying scientific language as emotional management. The Calder brothers stood together in silence, positioned closer to the sledges than to the open ice, an instinctive spatial choice that I found entirely understandable. Dahl crouched and pressed his bare palm to the ice for a long moment, then stood and said nothing. Fenwick stood with his arms at his sides and watched the bulges move in their slow arc until they had passed beyond the northern horizon, and then said in a completely level voice, that we would discuss it in the morning and that everyone should return to sleep. I did not sleep for the remainder of that night. I do not believe anyone else did either. In the morning, Royce walked to the area where the bulges had appeared and examined the surface carefully. No fracture lines, no visible distortion, no evidence of structural stress. The ice was intact and uniform. He noted that the ice in the region was approximately 45 feet deep and that beneath it was open ocean. Then he said, in a measured tone, that certain large marine animals were capable of swimming in close contact with the underside of ice shelves, and that the displacement of a very large animal moving in shallow water beneath relatively thin ice could conceivably produce visible surface deformation. And he then said the deformation pattern was approximately 40 feet across at its widest point. Both men were quiet. Royce said certain whale species could reach lengths considerably exceeding 40 feet. He did not say the word whale again for the rest of the expedition. Fenwick called a brief planning meeting and proposed 2 decisions. We would continue the survey as scheduled, as there was no logical basis for abandoning the mission on the strength of an unexplained natural phenomenon. And we would relocate the day's measurement stations to the eastern transect, in the opposite direction from where the bulges had been observed. He presented this without drama, and I respected that. If he was concerned, he did not permit his concern to affect his judgment. The eastern transect work went well. The ice here was thicker. Dahl estimated 60 feet in places, older and more consolidated. We established 2 new triangulation stations and completed a full boring sequence at 3 sites. The work had its usual effect on morale. Purposeful physical activity in a structured environment is one of the most reliable antidotes to anxiety that exists, and by mid-afternoon, the camp felt nearly normal again. We did not talk about what we had seen. By unspoken agreement, the subject was simply absent, a kind of collective emotional economy in which the unnecessary expenditure of anxiety is avoided because everyone understands that once released into a group's shared atmosphere, it is very difficult to contain. The 3rd night was quiet. No tremors, no surface deformations. I slept reasonably well. But it was during the following day's transit to the survey position that Dahl stopped the sled column. We were crossing a section of shelf identified on Fenwick's chart as a known thin ice zone. Dahl had been checking the surface ahead with his ice probe at regular intervals. He stopped the lead sled and held up his hand for a complete halt. Then he stepped forward approximately 10 paces, crouched, and pressed his ear to the ice surface. He held that position for perhaps 20 seconds. Then he stood, walked back, and told Fenwick very quietly that we needed to change our route. Fenwick asked what he had heard. Dahl said he had heard scraping. He described it with his characteristic precision, a deep, slow scraping sound transmitting through the ice from below. Rhythmic, like something being dragged across a surface, but too regular to be debris movement and too sustained to be a cracking event. The sound was moving, shifting from northwest to northeast as he listened, passing beneath them and continuing on a slow arc. Whatever was producing it was doing so at a depth of no more than 30 or 40 feet. He said the ice in this section was between 20 and 30 feet deep, and that he was not willing to take a loaded sled across it with that sound coming from below. No one argued. We rerouted. The detour added 90 minutes to our transit. As we moved, I found myself watching the ice surface beneath the sled with a new and particular attention, looking for anything in the blue-white translucence of the upper ice layers that might suggest movement below. I saw nothing, but I was looking, and in the fact that I was looking was itself a kind of knowledge I had not possessed 3 days earlier. That evening, Royce asked Dahl, with careful professional neutrality, whether in his years of polar travel he had encountered anything that had caused him genuine concern. Dahl was quiet for a long time. Then he said that in the Barents Sea, on his second crossing, the ship he had been on encountered a section of broken ice showing deformation from below over a very wide area, several hundred yards of disturbed surface moving in a direction inconsistent with the prevailing current. The captain had altered course immediately and had not discussed the matter afterward. Dahl said he had never learned what caused the deformation and had never asked. He then said, in the same flat, factual tone, that the scraping he had heard that day was louder than anything he had heard before, and that he did not know what was making it. The fourth day brought weather. A moderate snow began in the morning, not severe enough to halt work, but sufficient to reduce visibility. We worked the eastern line and made reasonable progress. Nothing unusual during the day. No tremors, no sounds, no visible movement in the ice. That night, the ice bulged directly beneath the camp. I was awake when it happened, sitting up writing notes, and the sensation was entirely different from the distant tremors of the first night. The ice moved upward beneath me, slowly and with enormous force, and the tent floor rose perhaps 2 or 3 inches at its center, and then settled. Then it rose again. The tent poles vibrated. Equipment suspended from the roof line swung. When the sound that came with it was the sound Dahl had described, a deep, slow scraping that seemed to come from everywhere at once because the ice itself was its medium, felt in my teeth and in the small bones behind my ears. It lasted approximately 45 seconds. Then it passed, moving away beneath the surface with the same slow deliberateness with which it had arrived, the sound and movement diminishing together until there was nothing but the settling creak of tent fabric and the sound of 5 men breathing. Nobody spoke for a long time. Then Fenwick, from near the tent entrance, said very quietly that everyone should remain inside, remain still, and that no one should use a lantern. We lay in darkness and listened. The ice beneath us settled and was silent. The dogs outside were making a sound I had not heard from them before. Not barking, not howling. A low, sustained whimper that each dog seemed to produce separately and simultaneously, a quiet, collective distress that was in some ways more unsettling than any bark. It went on for approximately 10 minutes and then faded. After another 10 minutes, Fenwick permitted a single lantern at low flame and conducted what I can only describe as a damage assessment of the group's state. He looked at each of us in turn and asked quietly whether anyone had been injured. Nobody had. He then asked Royce for his current assessment. Royce said that there were documented cases of large cephalopods, specifically giant squid, approaching the underside of polar ice in feeding behaviors, and that in theory, a very large specimen moving in shallow water beneath thin ice could produce measurable surface deformation. He paused, and then added that the deformation we had just experienced covered an area consistent with something significantly larger than any documented cephalopod specimen. The word significantly was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. Bridwell said in a careful voice that he wanted to note for the record that the deformation had appeared to move in a directed arc around the camp perimeter before passing beneath the main tent, and that this pattern was inconsistent with an animal transiting on a fixed course. He said it had appeared to circle us. He said it once and did not repeat it, and the silence that followed was the particular silence that descends on intelligent people when someone has articulated what all of them already know, but none of them wanted to say. Fenwick looked at Bridwell for a moment. Then he said that we would review the situation in full daylight and that everyone should attempt to sleep. He banked the lantern, and the tent was dark again, and I lay there thinking about the shape of what had moved beneath us, 40 or 50 feet across, moving in a slow, deliberate arc, at a depth that meant it was barely beneath us at all. I lay there thinking about the survey map that Bridwell and I had been constructing over the preceding days. I had been drawing it with the methodical confidence of a man documenting a known world, recording measurements and depths with the assumption that what lay beneath the ice was simply ocean and the geological features of the shelf floor. It had not occurred to me, not truly, that the ocean beneath 40 feet of ice might contain something capable of making decisions, something that might have noticed us. In the morning, Fenwick and Dahl walked the camp perimeter and measured the snow surface carefully. The camp showed no structural damage. The ice surface showed no fracture lines or visible distortion. Whatever had passed beneath it had done so without leaving any permanent mark above. Dahl reported that to the northwest, approximately 200 yards out, there was a section of surface ice showing a very slight ridge, perhaps an inch of upward displacement running across approximately 60 feet in a gentle curve. It could have been a natural pressure ridge. Dahl said only that it had not been there the previous morning, and that he had no explanation for it. Royce spent the morning examining that ridge with intense concentration. He measured it, sketched it in his journal, though he said nothing about his conclusions. In the afternoon he asked Dahl very quietly, while Fenwick was occupied with the survey charts, whether large marine animals were known to follow or track objects on the ice surface above them. Dahl said he knew of no documented case of this. What Royce was asking, what we were all thinking, was whether it knew we were here. We resumed survey work on the 5th day, restricted entirely to the eastern section and with a modified schedule that had us back in camp well before darkness. Fenwick made no formal announcement about the altered procedures, but they had emerged naturally from the group over breakfast, as though everyone had independently arrived at the same practical conclusions. Nobody suggested abandoning the expedition, and we were professional men on a mission with specific objectives and a fixed schedule, and those facts provided a structure I think all of us were grateful for. But the work was different now. The quality of attention we brought to the ice surface had changed. We were always watching it. Not constantly, not with the fixed stare of obvious anxiety, but with the peripheral watchfulness of men who have learned that the ground they stand on is not simply ground. When I set up my survey instrument and bent to the eyepiece, I was aware of the ice beneath my feet in a way I had never been before, a faint, continuous background awareness of its thickness, its depth, what lay beneath it. On the 6th day, the Calder brothers were working a boring station approximately half a mile from camp when they saw something through the ice. They came back together, walking at a pace that was just fast enough to be notable. Not running, not exhibiting panic, but moving with a purposefulness that communicated itself before either spoke. Robert Calder reported to Fenwick in a direct and factual manner that was admirable given what he described. He said that while boring at Station 7, they had been working on a section of ice that was translucent, thinner than the surrounding surface, perhaps 15 to 20 feet deep. While James operated the boring equipment, Robert had been standing to the side watching the ice surface. At approximately 10:30, he had observed, through the translucent ice, a shadow. It was very large. He had difficulty estimating scale because he had no reference point in the clear water below, but it was wider than the boring station area, which covered approximately 30 feet. The shadow moved steadily from north to south, passing directly beneath his position, and it was clearly defined enough that he could see it had a specific form. Not simply a change in the depth of the water, but a solid object with edges, with a shape. He could not identify the shape precisely because of the distortion of the ice, but it was neither linear nor symmetrical, and at its nearest point to the surface he had a distinct impression of texture to its form, something suggesting it was not smooth. It took approximately 4 minutes to complete its transit and did not vary its depth or speed during that time. It simply moved beneath them, slowly and without any change to its bearing, and passed on into darker water to the south. King James confirmed everything his brother had said and added one detail. At the moment of closest approach, when the shadow was at its largest and most defined, the boring equipment in his hands had vibrated. Not from ice movement. The equipment had been at rest in his grip. He said the vibration came through the ice and up through the handle and into his hands, and that it was rhythmic. He said it felt, and he hesitated before using the word, like a pulse. Nobody spoke for a moment after James Calder said this. Royce asked, in a controlled voice, how large Robert believed the shadow to have been. Robert said he had thought about this carefully on the walk back, and his best estimate, accounting for ice distortion, was that the object was no less than 80 feet in its longest visible dimension, and perhaps wider than that. 80 feet. Not Fenwick received this information with the same composed attentiveness he had brought to every development. He thanked the Calder brothers for the clear account and asked Royce for his assessment. Royce said that the largest accurately measured giant squid on record was approximately 43 feet. The largest reliably documented whale species, the blue whale, reached lengths of approximately 90 to 100 feet, and blue whales were known to feed in Antarctic waters. The shadow described was consistent in scale with a large whale transiting beneath the ice shelf. He said this with the careful emphasis of a man aware that the explanation he is offering is not entirely adequate to the description he has been given, but who has decided that an inadequate natural explanation is preferable to none at all. Bridwell said nothing. He was looking at the survey map on the table, tracing a line on it with his finger, working slowly through the positions of our observations over the past 6 days. I watched him do this and understood what he was doing. He was mapping the movements, plotting the arcs and the transits and the positions of the tremors and surface deformations against the geography of our camp and the survey zone. He was looking at the pattern. I did not ask him what he found. I could see enough of his expression to understand that I did not want to know yet. That night, the temperature dropped and the wind picked up from the south. The dogs were quiet. The ice was quiet. Dahl checked the surface before sleep and reported nothing unusual. I woke at an unknown hour to complete silence and a full moon. I became aware of the silence gradually. The way one becomes aware of conditions during a partial waking, and then I became aware that it was wrong. Not the ordinary silence of a calm polar night. This silence was beneath those sounds. It had replaced something, and what it had replaced, I understood slowly, was a subliminal vibration that had been present in the ice surface beneath me to some degree for the past 6 days, a vibration so constant and so low that I had ceased to consciously register it, but which had been there, a background presence transmitted through the ice into the body, quiet and deep and rhythmic. It was gone. I lay still and felt for it. Nothing. The ice was absolutely still. Whatever had been moving beneath the surface had stopped, or it was waiting. I did not sleep again. When morning came, I said nothing about what I had noticed and spent the early hours trying to determine whether my perception of the vibrations had been real or anxiety-induced misperception. It was possible I had simply been feeling the normal micro-movement of the ice shelf and interpreting it through the filter of everything else. A reasonable alternative. I held it alongside the other one, the one in which the vibration had been real, and its cessation was itself a form of communication. Something had been moving beneath us for 6 days, and now it had stopped. Bridwell showed me his map analysis after breakfast when the others were occupied with equipment maintenance. He spread the working map on the equipment sledge and pointed to a series of small pencil marks, each annotated with a date and time. And he had plotted every observed incident: the tremors, the surface bulges, the scraping sounds, Dahl's observation on the transit route, the Calder brothers' sighting, the surface ridge north of camp. He had connected them with careful lines. The movements had been describing a series of overlapping arcs. Each arc was centered, within a reasonable margin, on our camp. The entity beneath the ice had not simply been transiting through the area. It had been circling us, each circuit somewhat tighter than the last, the arcs closing slowly over the course of 6 days. The most recent close approach had been the transit of the boring station half a mile from camp the previous day, the innermost arc yet. And last night, for the first time, it had stopped. I looked at the map for a long time. There was nothing to say. The map said everything, and in what it said was something both of us already understood. We had been under observation, watched with the patient, methodical attention of something taking its time. And now the watching had stopped, or changed in character, or arrived at some decision. We told Fenwick. He looked at the map for a long time. He asked Bridwell to take him through the methodology, which Bridwell did with precision and without editorial comment. Fenwick asked 2 or 3 clarifying questions. Then he set the map down and looked out through the tent entrance at the ice surface for a long time without speaking. He called the full group together. He presented the situation in the clear, unembellished manner of a naval officer briefing his men. The survey data gathered represented approximately 60% of the planned mission objective, the good quality and scientific value. The past 6 days had presented a series of anomalous events in the ice environment. Consultations with the team had produced a map analysis, suggesting the observed phenomena were consistent with a single large object moving in a deliberate pattern beneath the ice shelf. That pattern raised questions about the safety of continuing operations that he could not, in good conscience, dismiss. As expedition leader, his primary responsibility was the safety of the men under his command. In his judgment, the situation warranted a precautionary relocation approximately 3 miles to the east and north, to terrain where ice depth measurements indicated a significantly greater structural buffer, and where the observed phenomena had not been recorded. So this would involve some reduction in operational efficiency and might require leaving some planned survey work incomplete. These were acceptable costs. He said all of this in the same level tone he used for routine operational discussions. He was not alarmed. He was not dramatic. He was a commander making a decision based on assessed risk, and in that moment I had perhaps the highest opinion of him I have ever had of any man. We began breaking camp immediately. The relocation took most of the day. We were efficient and systematic, which is the only way to manage a polar camp move, and the physical activity was again useful as psychological grounding. The dogs worked well. The surface to the east was firm and consistent. By evening, we had a functioning, secure base on thick, consolidated ice that Dahl approved with what, for him, amounted to strong enthusiasm. Nothing happened that night, or the next, or the one after that. The remaining 4 days were entirely without incident. We worked the eastern transit systematically and completed approximately 80% of our overall survey objective, which Fenwick judged a good outcome given the preceding complications. The ice was quiet, the surface undisturbed, the dogs calm. The evenings in the new camp had a quality I can only describe as relief expressed as normalcy, the relief of men who have returned from somewhere dangerous to somewhere safe, expressing that relief through the simple, sustained activity of doing their work well. We did not return to the area where the phenomenon had been observed. We did not attempt to investigate further, to gather additional data, or to photograph or document it more precisely. Fenwick did not suggest this, and no one else did either. I think the reason was not cowardice, but something more fundamental, an instinctive recognition that the thing beneath the ice had permitted us our 6 days of observation, our slow comprehension, our one close approach, and had then permitted us to leave. Attempting to press any further claim on that territory would be testing a forbearance that had no obligation to continue. We were collected by the relief ship on the scheduled date and returned to the coast without incident. On the ship, the group was largely silent on the subject of what had happened. We spoke about the survey results, the technical aspects of the work. We had the slightly hollow collegiality of men who have shared something they cannot fully discuss. And on the second evening, Royce and Fenwick had a long private conversation in the ship's small common room. I do not know what was said, but when it was over, Fenwick looked, for the first time I'd observed, genuinely tired. Not from physical exertion, from a long and difficult consideration. The official expedition report submitted to the Royal Geographical Society in March of 1912 noted that the survey had completed approximately 80% of its planned objective due to adverse ice conditions in the primary survey zone, necessitating relocation and operational adjustment. It recorded the tremors and surface vibrations as probable minor seismic events. It noted the sled party testimony regarding sounds as likely evidence of tidal stress fracturing. And it noted the observation of a large marine animal at Station 7 as consistent with whale activity in the area. The report was accurate in the sense that everything it contained was factually true, in the limited way that a description of symptoms without diagnosis is factually true. The phenomenon was not discussed in any official document that I am aware of. It was not reported to the Admiralty. It was not submitted to any scientific body. It was not referenced in any subsequent expedition literature. It was, in the practical sense, as though it had never been observed. Only our personal journals recorded it in full, and at least one of those journals disappeared entirely from its owner's effects upon his death. What lives in my memory with the greatest persistence is not the moments of greatest drama, not the night the ice moved beneath the camp or the boring station sighting. What lives most persistently is the moment standing outside in the dark on the second night, watching the ice surface rise and fall in its slow, deliberate arc around the northern edge of the camp. The absolute cold, the vast stillness of the Antarctic sky, and the knowledge forming in me as I watched, the knowledge that what was beneath the ice was not simply large, but was also slow in the particular way of things that have no need of hurry. It was not moving quickly. It was not alarmed or reactive. It was moving at the pace of something that has no expectation of being opposed, no reason to rush, no concept of human urgency. That slowness was what I could never adequately explain to anyone who was not there. The tremors could be explained as seismic activity. The surface deformations could be attributed to marine animal transit. The sounds could be attributed to ice fracture and tidal stress. But the slowness, the deliberate and patient quality of those arcing movements around and beneath us was the thing no natural explanation could fully accommodate. Because the kind of patience expressed in that behavior is not simply the absence of speed. It is a quality of attention. It is the behavior of something that is aware. I am a scientist. I spent my professional life applying precise methodology to the measurement and description of the physical world, and I have never made claims beyond what the evidence supports. I am making one now, based on 7 days of direct observation in the Antarctic summer of 1911. Something lives beneath the ice of that shelf. Something of enormous size. Something that had been there long before any human being set foot on that continent, and that will very likely be there long after the last of us has gone. It knew we were there. It watched us with the unhurried attention of something that has watched many things over a very long time. And when we left, it let us go. I have thought sometimes about why it let us go. Whether our small number made us beneath its interest, or whether it made some assessment and decided we were not worth the effort, or whether it was simply curious, and when its curiosity was satisfied, it returned to whatever it does in those black depths. I do not know. I do not expect to know. The things that have survived in those regions since before the age of mammals have no obligation to be comprehensible to us. Say, and the desire to find comprehensibility in them is itself a form of arrogance, the assumption that everything that exists must ultimately be interpretable in terms we can manage. What I know is this: the Antarctic is not empty. It has never been empty. Those who went south with maps and instruments and the confidence of men charting an unknown world were not charting emptiness. They were walking over something. And that something was, in the winter of 1911, paying attention. 7 men arrived on that ice shelf to measure and record. We measured and recorded what we could, and then we picked up our instruments and we left, and I think that was the correct decision. There are places in the world where correctness means recognizing the limits of your claim. We had no claim on that ice. We were visitors, and briefly, and by forbearance, we were allowed to be visitors. The thing beneath the ice stayed where it was, where it belongs, in the darkness and the cold and the silence that is its native country, moving in its slow, patient arcs through waters that have held it since before our species learned to walk upright on land. I have never been on ice again, not once in 55 years. My colleagues ask why, and I tell them I prefer warmer climates in my later years, which is true, but is not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I remember what it felt like to stand on 40 feet of ice over a black Antarctic ocean and feel something enormous moving beneath me. And I know that if I were ever to stand on ice again, in any form, I would feel that memory in my feet. Some territories do not belong to us. We did not own that ice shelf. We did not own the ocean beneath it. And we were permitted to pass across its surface, and we were permitted to leave. And I have spent 55 years being grateful for both of those permissions, without knowing who or what granted them, or why.